Hi, my name is Madison Thompson, and this is for Biology 102, Section 4. This is my Phylum Project archive, and this is Bryophyta. So phylum Bryophyta, division Bryophyta, has several defining characteristics. It includes all mosses, and in some publications, it's also shown to include liverworts. And all of these organisms have to be multicellular and enclosed. Otherwise, they're not considered to be in this phylum. All of these organisms typically do not have water-conducting cells. Instead, they have a specialized organ that relies on their growing region to produce runoff or water that they can absorb. And that's why many are found in sidewalk cracks, downhill slopes, or moist dirt, where they're able to absorb water that's flowing by, and they don't have to search for it because they can't produce it on their own. And organisms in this phylum, the special organ is called a rhizoid, and rhizoids help to keep low-growing plants rooted and absorb water from the surface. So it's not a root, but it's a root-like organ that functions as both a root and a water-absorbing organ. And all of these organisms possess no vascular tissue, distinguishing them from the Tracheophyta division. The specific organism in question is Dicranium scoparium, and this is also commonly called broom moss. It's in the kingdom Plantae in the phylum Bryophyta. You can see the taxonomic information on the right. And a little bit about the name. The Greek prefix di on the word cranum, similar to the Latin word cranium for skull, represents the forked ends. So how the ends of the moss, and you'll see in the next slide in the pictures, fork off like this. It's also why it's called broom moss. So there's a big connection there. But di meaning two. So it talks about two heads like cranum. And the scoparium is talking about the scope, the fact that this moss covers a large geographic area. So here's some images. These were taken at my house. Here's some moss growing on the tree. And here's the tree from a distance, so you can kind of see that it's occupying a large area, going back to that scoparium that we talked about a little bit ago. And then over here on the close-up where it's growing in the holes in the stump specifically, so that you can see it's finding a way to leach water, where water is going to collect in those holes when it rains. And you can see the little ends poking out in different directions. It's that forked characteristic. So that's how this organism is kind of easily identifiable in nature. And mode of nutrition. This is a photoautotroph, meaning it produces its own energy from sunlight using chloroplast, and it forms glucose through photosynthesis. So it's responsible for bringing in its own energy and for converting it into a usable form. It's completely self-reliant and often a surplus of energy as a result of this. Its carrying capacity nutrient would be water because it can't conduct that on its own with no vascular tissue. And this organism gains carbon from the atmosphere. It must do so to complete photosynthesis, so it's a necessary process to be a photoautotroph. And it absorbs water through rhizoids. Again, rhizoids are those root-like structures that keep the plants rooted while also allowing them to collect water that's running off or happens to be on their surface in their immediate environment. Mode of reproduction. So in this organism, females are in charge of the mating process. There's dwarf males, and they land on female cells, but they're substantially smaller. And this is like the spore reproduction we discussed earlier with the fungi, but it's more widespread. It's more community-based. The fungi can often mate with themselves, and so can the moss, but typically the moss doesn't mate with itself, but typically mates with someone else. So it's gametic meiosis because one plant gives off sperm cells and one is full of egg cells. And eventually it goes through two distinct periods of life to allow this gametic meiosis to occur. And they're the gametophyte and sporophyte phases. And the organism spends most of its time as a haploid in the gametophyte phase. And the sporophyte phase is a diploid period of development. Similar to humans being in the uterus, there's a placenta, cell, and tissues that develop to support the development of a spore that protrudes from the moss. And the sporophyte phase is parasitic on the mother and dependent on her for food and water. And once it's developed, it'll break off and be spread, allowing the moss to undergo spork division. So it goes through both spork and gametic meiosis. And the gametic meiosis is when you have the actual egg and sperm from the dwarf male and the female. The female is that large area. The dwarf male is a little protrusion that happens to land on it. So those dwarf males actually form by, we're going to go back to the highlighter, when you have the large female cell here, and then the dwarf male comes along and just kind of stops here, and there's nowhere for it to occupy, right? It's not going to take over because there's this large organism already living in that space. So instead it becomes a mating partner and kind of just waits until it's needed. And once its response is elicited, it forms a spore with the male or the female, and the two go through gametic meiosis, but it's still sporic meiosis because of how the offspring forms, and it forms as a spore. And the organism also spends most of its time in a haploid stage, which is characteristic of the meiosis that sporic meiosis is. And so the source, range, and distribution, there were some samples found at NCANT, but this has been changed. I took some pictures at my house instead, and I don't want to give my address away, so we're just going to reference NCANT as the site, because I do live in the same area. And then this organism is found in Australia, North America, Middle America, Southern Asia, Northern Asia, and Europe. There are some mosses found in the Arctic region, but they're less common and not the species that we're studying specifically. This Dracanium scoporium is native to Alaska, Canada, Mexico, and the continental United States, but it has a clump distribution. It's found worldwide across Asia, Europe, and North America, but it's not found everywhere else. So it's found in very concentrated pockets, but outside of those pockets, it's non-existent. So it's clumped because it's here, but never here. So in a way, it could also be considered dispersive distribution because it's spread out across the world. And it is not uniform. That is the one thing we do know. So here's a picture of the habitat. These are the woods in which a lot of the moss was found. And as you can see, growing up these trees, there are some instances of the moss existing at higher altitudes. So they like to grow in moist areas with plenty of organic life or tree cover. They can form a relationship with the tree where they're taking in its nutrients as it flows through the veins in the tree. So that could be a parasitic relationship. So that's something to be mindful of with this organism. And it grows well on flat surfaces on the forest floor, so they can absorb water. And this is done through root-like appendages called the rhizoids. So that's why you never see moss kind of like just freely dangling or growing vertically up. It has to be spread out, scoparium, and it has to be flat so that those rhizoids can make contact and perform their function, as they are an organ that plays a part in controlling the entirety of two very important life functions for the organism. So the primary ecological role of Dracanium scoparium is helping to prevent erosion and maintaining water in soil. Because water is few and far between for this organism, when it gets water, it stays moist for a very long period of time. And that's kind of navigating those cell networks and those broom-like ends we talked about. They're very good at keeping water in and maintaining it through physical means. And it also prevents erosion by covering loose areas of otherwise free dirt. A good example of this is when you see moss instead of grass, and then under that moss is here to pill it up. It's dark brown dirt. It's very healthy, very moist. You can tell that there's lots of humus developing there, and as a result, this organism is very important in preventing erosion and keeping that dirt together and promoting a healthy ecological balance in the soil. And it's commonly used for remeditative gardens, and recent research has shown this organism is able to absorb lead and other heavy metals, so it might be able to cleanse and the environment and mitigate pollution. So it's becoming much more common in areas where there might be toxic water supply, toxic runoff, or people are just overly concerned with having very clean water. And here are my references. Thank you for watching. I hope that you could learn something from this video today.